So the first one is for Joe. It says, in a food industry that handles dust and sugar with some humidity, is a mitigation system necessary? What kind of isolation valve is needed? Pneumatic or mechanical?
So again, we had discussed about if you feel that your dust might be combustible, we always recommend doing a DHA. That DHA will point out very specific values. It'll point out recommendations of what type of protection you're going to need. Based on that DHA, we can then go into several different options for protection and mitigation devices. So is mitigation system necessary? It depends on what the DHA comes back with. As far as what kind of isolation valve is needed, uh, it depends. We typically go with a mechanical passive isolation valve in our applications.
Cool. Thank you. The
Mhm.
next one is how to prevent fire events in laser cutting and laser marking applications when both aluminum and ferrous dust are present.
As far as equipment goes, we can offer spark detection with a mechanical fire break shutter, um, and we also do spark traps as well.
Great.
I'll just add too that it is important to go do the DHA because you may have a mix of dusts that might be extremely explosible, so much so that a regular cartridge collector or bag house cannot be made safe. You might have to go with a wet collector. Or depending on what the DHA says, you might have a mixture that's combustible that we can manage with the spark detection uh, mechanical valves and the like. So it just depends. So that's where we would ask you as a customer to send us some information on your process. Like, what is it? Have you done a DHA? By the way, we can help you do that. We can help coordinate that with a approved lab and everything. And once we have that, we have the equipment, we have the DHA results. We can help guide you to what's going to be required and safe.
Awesome. So the next question is for you, Matt. What are some OSHA regulations regarding combustible dust?
Okay, so now we're getting into the law, the legal requirements, and the NFPA stuff. So OSHA, which basically regulates your facility if you're in the United States, OSHA is the law essentially that says your facility must comply with these things. Specifically for combustible dust, OSHA has what's called a National Emphasis Program or an NEP specific to combustible dust. So if you just Google OSHA combustible dust NEP, you'll bring up their whole list of requirements. Now, within there, they kind of tell you what is required. You have to mitigate and the risk associated with combustible dust. They're not as prescriptive necessarily as the NFPA, which is referenced in the OSHA standard. NFPA is, you can think of it as like a list of guidelines. So industry experts over the years have developed the NFPA standards to serve as the benchmark for combustible dust protection. OSHA, as like the legal regulatory authority, points to the NFPA and says, if you have combustible dust and you follow the NFPA guidelines, you should be good. I will just add as one little caveat, really NFPA, like I said, is not the law, it's the benchmark. So you can design your whole system to align with the NFPA standards and requirements. You still may have your fire marshal or your OSHA regulator come in and say, I want you to do this, this, or the other thing for whatever reasons. So that's why we always recommend that the customer bring in your regulators like with the plan so that because they're ultimately the one that's going to sign off is your facility up to code or not. NFPA is there as the benchmark standard where everything we recommend is going to be in compliance with NFPA and the OSHA inspector is going to look at the NFPA and agree with it. But you also need to bring in that stakeholder, your regulator, let them know what you're going to do. So if they have questions that we can address them up front.
Awesome. All right, and the next question is also for you, Matt. He's a customer that says, I am an architect and I'd like to understand what the proper steps are for confirming the appropriate building occupancy based on the DHA. How is determined if the hazard is great enough to require a hazardous building occupancy H2 designation?
Okay. So I looked at this question beforehand. I had to go do a little bit of digging to get a good answer. So there's two things they're talking about here. There's the building occupancy requirements and basically an architectural standard, IFC tables. And then you have the DHA. So there's a follow-on text where they're asking like why is it so why isn't there a clear answer to is it an H2 occupancy or not? It's because usually when you go get a DHA done, that third-party DHA firm is going to know the DHA, the NFPA stuff up, backwards and forwards. They're not necessarily going to be as familiar with the architectural standards for what's a hazardous building. So the answer that I was able to find, and I'm getting a little outside of my experience here, but basically the presence of combustible dust in the facility is not alone enough to trigger an H2 classification. It depends how that combustible dust is mitigated. So, if you have combustible dust in your facility and you have added explosion vents, isolation, CO2, suppression, all the stuff that the NFP guidelines tell you to do, you should be able to avoid the H2 classification because basically it says that you have combustible dust, but you've mitigated the risk. So typically it wouldn't be the DHA, auditor that defines that. It would be whoever is going to approve your occupancy designation. That may be like the architectural regulator. So that's getting a little bit outside of what we typically do. We focus on equipment and dust collection systems, how to mitigate the combustible dust risk. When you start getting a building code and stuff, there's other regulatory bodies out there, but my takeaway from what I could find online was basically if you're controlling and mitigating the combustible dust risk to the extent that you can say that it's safe, then you should be able to avoid the H2 occupancy classification. So I hope that answers the question. If not, whoever submitted that, if they want to send an email or set up a follow-up, we can explore that further and get a good answer for them.
Sounds good. Thank you, Matt. Back to Joe. Is coal dust a hazard? Do you have any case study or experience with this kind of dust?
So coal dust can be a hazard. Again, we always recommend a full DHA done on the site to know for certain for that specific application. I've worked on several applications where they are using coal and there's coal dust and the DHA has come back with an ST1 class dust, ST1 KST values and all that stuff. So it just depends on what the DHA comes back with. But yes, it can be a hazard.
Yeah, so we would ask them that whoever answered or asked that question, send us some information on your process and we can help you figure it out.
And now back to Matt. The last question. Thoughts relative to zinc dust specifically. Our facility galvanizes steel pipe and tubing products and uses both cartridge and backstyle dust collectors with cyclones. We have had sparks make their way into the units and cause fires, and since then installed spark arrestors inline, as well as chemical fire suppression instead of water due to the reactive nature of zinc.
Yeah, so it sounds like so there's a combustible dust risk because they've had sparks ignite in the baghouse. So that's definitely a sign. We recommend they do the DHA to classify it. Maybe they've already done that and they've already installed spark arrestors, which is a nice protection mechanism in chemical fire protection. That sounds reasonable. I would just maybe ask or to see a little bit more about their equipment setup. Do they also have explosion protection, isolation, etc.? Sounds like they're taking the right steps, but to be fully compliant with NFPA, they might need more protection. I don't know, Joe, what would your approach be there?
Yeah, that would, I agree with everything you said. We talk about like, as far as that would be like, what was listed would be more fire protection equipment. We would also recommend the explosion protection side as well, which includes the venting, the isolation between the vessels. So yeah, exactly.
Cool. Awesome. All right, that was the last question. So thank you guys very much for those answers. That was very clear. We appreciate your participation.